Thank you, Senator Rice. Senator Fawcett. Sorry.
Deputy President. Look, I rise tonight on this adjournment just in case people haven't heard enough about submarines, to talk about submarines and shipbuilding in Australia. One of the problems with debates like we've had today, originally we had the urgency motion, which was subsequently pulled because pretty much the whole day the productivity of both the House and the Senate was lost in a political debate around shipbuilding and particularly submarines. Now, the problem with political debates is that people tend to take sides, they get entrenched in positions, and look, there's plenty of ammunition from my side, and I'm not going to throw it now. You've heard my colleagues speak on that. The other side, I'm sure, feel as though they have ammunition, but the Australian public actually expect us to be here to chart out a path for the future that makes our industry sustainable and makes our Defence Force one that is best equipped in the world in a manner that is sustainable, affordable, which is what taxpayers expect. So what I'd like to do is just talk a little about some of the substantive issues that get lost in the political debates such as that which we've had today. What has been fascinating, both in the contributions here, but more interestingly, the views of the public that you see as there are articles published and lots of comments get put on them and people send you through emails, is that there's a whole range of perceptions in the political world, in the public, in the media, about what has or hasn't happened that should therefore shape the future. I'd just like to touch on a few of those. And firstly, to the history of shipbuilding, and particularly submarines here in Australia. Dud subs. Everyone loves to talk about dud subs. But can I tell you, when it comes to the Collins-class submarine, that is a really inappropriate and unfair title. Yes, they had some problems, but the manufacturing side of it, the vast majority of problems were with equipment that came from overseas or with work that was done from overseas. The major welding reworks that delayed the entry into service of the first two submarines was done in Sweden. The welding problem was from there. The welds here in the four main sections of the boat never had a problem and still haven't had a problem. The original combat system was an American combat system from Rockwell. There were some other inputs, Computer Sciences Australia and a few other people who were involved in partnerships, but essentially it was a Rockwell system and it didn't deliver. In fact, it took an Australian company, Acacia, a gentleman called Ted Huber in South Australia, who was engaged to look at the system and assess it, and he said, you know what, it's not going to work. And so it was actually Australian expertise who belled the cat and said this system's not going to actually be fit for purpose. And so when people love to look at the major things that delayed Collins, when it comes to the fundamentals of the design, and particularly to the Australian contribution, there is not too much that you can put your finger on and say, this is a unique Australian problem, therefore we should never build a submarine in Australia again. A lot of the problems, in fact, come down to the contracting arrangements in terms of split responsibilities. And I compare and contrast, just like a school essay. I look at what happens with Toyota, who are making vehicles here in Australia. We don't have an Australian government-owned factory making a car that's designed by someone else. No, they come here, they employ Australians, and they make the car, but it's a Toyota factory. Well, if we're going to learn anything from the Collins, it would be that a future build should be a fixed-price contract with a company who are going to be responsible for actually building and delivering the submarine to the agreed standard. Now, that could mean that they take over on a temporary or permanent basis facilities in Adelaide at ASC. They would employ much, if not all, of the workforce from there, but this split responsibility was a huge factor in Collins as to why many things went off the rails. Interestingly, the Coles report, which was done recently, and credit to the former government for commissioning the Coles report, identified that and I read from the key findings here. The study found that the Collins-class submarines are capable submarines which are competently designed and operated by the Royal Australian Navy. However, many of the problems with the Collins fleet stemmed from a failure to put in adequate sustainment arrangements on entry to service and subsequently to adopt adequate processes for reliability. It's led to maintenance backlogs, inefficient practices and reduced submarine availability, which is part of the reason. Given my own background in aerospace and looking at what Defence has had to do to keep our aircraft airworthy, serviceable, mission-ready, it's part of the reason I'm so adamant that we approach defence procurement from the point of view of making sure we develop in defence and in industry the kind of sovereign competence we need in engineering and fabrication skills that we can actually have design assurance for the equipment that we have. But what the Coles report clearly shows is that the Collins is a very capable submarine, and experience on operations or exercises with the US has shown that. What it was let down by was a poor logistics system. So the current situation, ASC, yes, they have some problems. Even the AMWU admitted in the Senate inquiry that's been recently held that there are problems with productivity. But they are getting better. I've been down there many times, being a South Australian senator, and I watched the progress of Ship 1, new ship Hobart, and also Ship 2, new ship Brisbane. And what I see is stark difference between Ship 1 and Ship 2 in terms of how they are approaching the work, the innovation they have brought in terms of how to put the ship together, how to integrate each module, fit it out, paint it, put the looms in so that the final connection is going to be so much quicker, says that productivity is increasing rapidly. And I have no doubt that by the time they get to Ship 3, they will have reached the benchmark that was set of 80 man-hours per tonne. The other important thing to remember is that there is a learning curve, and it's not just Australia, overseas as well. The US Congress and their Government Accountability Office, the UK Parliament, is full of inquiries into shipbuilding productivity because people get scared when they look at the first or second ship in a class and they go, oh my goodness, it's late and over budget. I mean, the Virginia class, a lot of people love to say the Virginia class is what Australia should be looking at. The first two boats were $1 billion over budget. The Astute class, built by the UK, £2 billion over budget for the first couple of boats, or the first 3 boats in the flight, and 4 years late. There's the LPD-17 class of ship in the US, 6,000 defects found on the first vessel, and over subsequent vessels it's decreased. And what we saw here in Australia with the ANZAC project was that allowing for that learning curve over time, the productivity gets better, the quality gets better, the cost per vessel comes down, and it is a successful project. So over time, we will get better, which means that in the future we can look to confidence for things like the future frigate, which is why the government's invested the $78.2 million to do the early engineering work so that we can look at putting the Australian CEA radar, the Saab 9LV combat system, which is designed and built in South Australia, into an air warfare destroyer hull, which will give us not only the learning curve and the efficiencies from those first 3 boats, but a further 8, which starts giving us, for the first time, a sustainable footing for the Australian shipbuilding industry. Now, that is the only option that we have. If you look at the air warfare destroyer and the LHD, the decisions for both of those programs were made by the Howard government, so that's at least 7 years ago. We're just reaching the point where we're approaching the valley of death. If we're going to address that valley of death now, decisions would have had to be made for a complete new build 6 or so years ago. So the only option to move forward is to find a way to use that learning that we've held on the AWD to carry that forward into a project. So this is the best way to A, address a need, to B, continue to build Australia's sovereign capabilities with radar and combat systems and shipbuilding, and to avoid that valley of death. In terms of submarines, ASC at the moment is doing significant work on Collins. They're actually cutting hulls open, remediating issues, doing overhauls to then put them back together. Those are the level of skills that you need to build submarines. And so Australian workers haven't completely lost that. I see no reason why, in an appropriate partnership, as we always do these things, whether it be with the Swedes, the Germans, Japanese or even the French, there is no reason why Australian industry cannot be involved in the final design phases and construction of a submarine, which, as I've argued consistently, is the best way to assure the sovereignty that we need. These are the issues we should be discussing, not the cheap politics that we've seen for so much of today.